In the shadow of Chicago's bustling West Side, beneath what appears to be an ordinary brownstone on Maple Street, lies one of America's most horrifying secrets. Between 1892 and 1923, the Martinez family operated what they called the Sacred Heart, Children's Sanctuary, claiming to provide care and education for orphaned and abandoned children. Official records show that 847 children entered those doors during those 31 years. Only 52 were ever documented leaving alive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rest simply vanished into the labyrinthine attic spaces that Francisco Martinez had converted into a maze of hidden chambers, where unspeakable horrors took place under the guise of Christian charity. What investigators discovered when they finally breached those walls in 1924 revealed a systematic operation so depraved that it challenged everything society believed about human nature and the protection of innocence. The true scope of the Martinez family's crimes remained buried in sealed federal documents for over 40 years, until a demolition crew in 1965 uncovered attic chambers filled with evidence that exposed the full magnitude of their operation. The children who disappeared weren't simply victims of neglect or disease. They were deliberately selected, systematically broken, and methodically eliminated in ways that defied comprehension. The Martinez family didn't start as monsters. They began as respected members of Chicago's growing Catholic community, arriving from Spain in 1885, with impressive credentials and unshakable faith that masked intentions darker than the city's coal-stained skies. Francisco Martinez presented himself as a former seminary instructor who had dedicated his life to caring for society's most vulnerable children, while his wife Carmen claimed extensive experience managing orphanages in Barcelona. Their reputation for piety and dedication to child welfare quickly earned them the trust of Chicago's religious and civic leaders, who were desperately seeking solutions to the growing problem of homeless and abandoned children flooding the city's streets. The rapid industrialization of Chicago had created a massive underclass of workers whose dangerous jobs and poverty often left children orphaned or abandoned, creating a humanitarian crisis that overwhelmed existing charitable institutions. Francisco Martinez stood 6 feet tall with the kind of commanding presence that made people listen when he spoke about God's calling to serve the innocent. His dark hair was always perfectly groomed, and his expensive suits spoke of both prosperity and respectability. When he quoted scripture, his rich baritone voice carried the authority of someone who genuinely believed he was doing divine work. But beneath his polished exterior lay a calculating mind that viewed children not as souls to be saved, but as resources to be exploited. His wife Carmen Martinez possessed an almost supernatural ability to project maternal warmth while harboring feelings of resentment and cruelty that ran deeper than Lake Michigan. She had perfected the art of appearing loving and nurturing to outside observers while systematically destroying the spirits of the children in her care. Carmen understood that breaking a child's will required different techniques than those used on adults, and she had spent years developing methods that were both effective and virtually undetectable to casual inspection. The Martinez family's operation expanded dramatically when Francisco's brother Diego joined them from New Mexico, bringing with him connections to a network of corrupt officials and businessmen who would prove essential to their enterprise. Diego Martinez had spent years working in territorial prisons and had learned valuable lessons about human nature, control, and the systematic application of fear. Unlike Francisco's religious facade, Diego operated from the shadows, handling the practical aspects of their operation that required a more direct approach to intimidation and violence. Their youngest son, Miguel Martinez, completed the family's inner circle when he reached adulthood in 1895. Miguel had been raised within the family's twisted value system, and had never known a world where children were treated as anything other than commodities to be managed and exploited. His youth and apparent innocence made him particularly effective at gaining the trust of new arrivals, who saw him as an older brother figure rather than another tormentor. The Sacred Heart Children's Sanctuary occupied a sprawling brownstone that Francisco had purchased and extensively modified to serve their purposes. The building's exterior maintained the respectable appearance of a well-funded charitable institution, complete with religious symbols and inspiring quotations carved into the stonework. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Visitors who came for official inspections saw clean dormitories, well-fed children engaged in educational activities, and evidence of the kind of moral instruction that Chicago's religious community demanded. What they never saw were the hidden passages Francisco had constructed throughout the building's upper floors, creating a network of concealed rooms and chambers that existed completely separate from the public areas. The attic had been transformed into something resembling an underground city, with multiple levels connected by narrow staircases and crawlways that allowed the family to move children between different areas without any possibility of outside detection. The building's acoustics had been carefully engineered to prevent sound from traveling between the public and private areas. Francisco had invested heavily in soundproofing materials and had designed the hidden chambers with thick walls that muffled even the most desperate cries for help. The layout was deliberately confusing, with corridors that led nowhere and rooms that could only be accessed through hidden panels, ensuring that any child who might escape one area would become hopelessly lost in the maze. The Martinez family marketed their services as a comprehensive solution to Chicago's orphan problem, offering not just basic care but educational opportunities and moral instruction that would transform abandoned children into productive citizens. They published elaborate brochures describing their revolutionary methods of character development and distributed testimonials from supposedly grateful former residents who had gone on to successful lives after graduating from their program. Their success in attracting financial support and official endorsement came from their understanding of what Chicago's elite wanted to hear. They promised to remove unsightly homeless children from the streets while transforming them into the kind of moral, hardworking individuals that society valued. The Martinez family presented themselves as the answer to both humanitarian concerns and practical urban problems, making their services irresistible to politicians and philanthropists alike. What made their operation particularly insidious was its integration into Chicago's legitimate child welfare system. The Martinez family had carefully cultivated relationships with judges, police officials, and social workers who routinely directed children to their facility. They had also established connections with hospitals, schools, and other institutions that came into contact with vulnerable children, creating a steady pipeline of victims who entered their system through apparently legitimate channels. Judge Walter Hoffman of the Cook County Juvenile Court became one of their most reliable sources of children, routinely sentencing orphans and runaways to the Sacred Heart Children's Sanctuary rather than to overcrowded public institutions. Hoffman's courtroom became a processing center where children, whose only crime was poverty or abandonment, found themselves delivered to the Martinez family's carefully disguised hell. Police Captain Thomas Sullivan controlled the flow of street children into the system through selective enforcement of vagrancy laws and truancy regulations that gave his officers broad discretion in deciding which children needed institutional intervention. Sullivan's officers were trained to identify children who had no family connections or social support systems, making them ideal candidates for the Martinez family's purposes because their disappearance would generate no inquiry or investigation. The Martinez family's clientele extended far beyond corrupt officials to include some of Chicago's most prominent businessmen and social leaders. Meatpacking magnate George Henderson maintained regular appointments at the facility, paying enormous sums for access to children who had been specifically selected and prepared according to his preferences. Railroad executive Charles Morrison used his wealth and influence to purchase exclusive access to certain areas of the facility, while department store owner William Crawford funded special programs that catered to his particular interests. Perhaps most disturbing was the involvement of Dr. James Peterson, who served as the facility's official physician while conducting unauthorized medical experiments on the children in his care. Peterson's research into pain tolerance, psychological conditioning, and physical development used the Martinez children as test subjects in studies that had no legitimate scientific purpose, but satisfied his curiosity about human suffering and endurance. The daily routine within the hidden areas of the Sacred Heart Children's Sanctuary followed a carefully designed pattern intended to break down resistance and create complete dependency on the Martinez family for survival. Children were processed through an intake system that began with the destruction of their previous identity and continued until they either died or were transformed into something barely recognizable as human. New arrivals were brought to the attic chambers through hidden passages that prevented them from understanding the building's layout or their location within it. The disorientation was deliberate and immediate, designed to make children feel completely helpless and dependent on their captors for basic survival needs like food, water, and shelter. The intake process began in what Carmen Martinez called the purification room, where children were stripped of their clothing and personal possessions in a ritual that served both practical and psychological purposes. Every item that connected then to their previous life was destroyed in front of them, including toys, photographs, letters, and even religious items that might provide comfort or hope. Children were assigned numbers rather than being called by their names, reinforcing their transformation from individuals into inventory items. Their hair was cut in identical styles, and they were dressed in uniform gray clothing that eliminated any expression of personality or individuality. The numbering system also served practical purposes, allowing the Martinez family to track their inventory and match specific children with client preferences without maintaining records that used real names. The attic chambers were designed to house different categories of children based on age, physical characteristics, and intended use. Younger children were kept in areas with slightly better conditions because they were considered more valuable and required more careful handling to maintain their usefulness. Older children who had proven resistant to conditioning were housed in progressively harsher conditions until they either submitted or were eliminated. The building's heating and lighting systems were used as tools of control, with different areas maintained at different temperatures and light levels to create discomfort and disorientation. Some chambers were kept in perpetual darkness to break down the children's sense of time and reality, while others were subjected to bright lights that prevented sleep and created constant stress. Food was used as both reward and punishment, with the Martinez family maintaining detailed records of each child's caloric intake and nutritional status to ensure they remained alive and functional without developing the strength or energy to resist. The diet was carefully calculated to maintain basic physiological functions, while creating a state of chronic hunger and weakness that made rebellion impossible. The Martinez family had developed an elaborate classification system that categorized children based on their perceived value and potential uses. The most attractive and compliant children were reserved for the family's highest-paying clients, while those who showed signs of resistance or defiance were subjected to increasingly harsh treatment designed to break their will or eliminate them entirely. Francisco Martinez maintained detailed psychological profiles of each child, documenting their fears, weaknesses, and responses to different forms of treatment. This information was used to design individualized conditioning programs that exploited each child's specific vulnerabilities while also providing valuable data for improving their methods with future victims. The family's record-keeping system was extraordinarily sophisticated, with multiple sets of books that tracked everything from individual children's physical development to client preferences and payment schedules. They maintained detailed financial records that showed the Sacred Heart Children's Sanctuary generating profits that would be worth millions in modern currency, making it one of the most financially successful criminal enterprises in American history. Their business model included multiple revenue streams beyond the obvious exploitation of children. They operated legitimate businesses that used child labor, sold children to wealthy families seeking domestic servants, and even maintained contracts with medical schools and research institutions that needed subjects for anatomical study and experimental procedures. The Martinez family's ability to operate for over 30 years without detection came from their sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate public perception and institutional oversight. They had learned that the best way to avoid suspicion was to exceed expectations in their public performance, while carefully compartmentalizing their criminal activities in ways that made discovery nearly impossible. Their public events and fundraising activities were elaborate productions that showcased happy, healthy children engaged in educational and recreational activities that impressed donors and officials. These performances were carefully choreographed, using children who had been specifically selected and trained for public appearances, while the majority of their victims remained hidden in the attic chambers where no outsider would ever see them. The Martinez family had also mastered the art of deflecting inquiry by maintaining relationships with influential allies who could intervene if questions were asked about their operations. Their network of supporters included religious leaders, politicians, and businessmen who had too much invested in the family's reputation to allow serious investigation of their methods. The Martinez family's transformation from respected caregivers into systematic predators didn't happen overnight. It evolved through years of careful planning, psychological conditioning, and the gradual erosion of moral boundaries that eventually consumed every member of their household. Understanding how ordinary people became capable of such extraordinary evil requires examining the individual journeys that led each family member down paths from which there could be no return. Francisco Martinez's descent into darkness began during his actual seminary training in Barcelona, where he first encountered the writings of medieval theologians who had justified extreme physical punishment as necessary for spiritual purification. Unlike his fellow students who found these historical practices disturbing, Francisco became fascinated by the psychological mechanisms that allowed religious authority to override human compassion. His professors noted his unusual interest in the more violent aspects of church history, but attributed it to academic curiosity rather than personal inclination. During his final year of seminary, Francisco volunteered to work at a local orphanage where he first experimented with the psychological techniques he had studied in historical texts. He began with minor manipulations, testing how effectively he could control children's behavior through carefully applied rewards and punishments. The success of these early experiments convinced him that children were far more malleable than adults, and that their natural dependence on authority figures made them ideal subjects for more extensive conditioning. Francisco's expulsion from seminary came not because his superiors discovered his experiments, but because of theological disagreements that he deliberately provoked to create a cover story for his departure. He had already decided that traditional religious life would constrain his ambitions, and he needed a plausible explanation for abandoning his clerical career that would actually enhance his credibility as a lay minister dedicated to child welfare. The years between his departure from Spain and his arrival in Chicago were spent traveling through Europe, studying different institutional models and refining his understanding of how to create and maintain total control over vulnerable populations. Francisco visited workhouses in England, reform schools in France, and industrial schools in Germany, learning from each system while identifying weaknesses that he could improve upon in his own operation. Carmen Martinez's psychological development followed a different but equally disturbing trajectory that began with her own traumatic childhood in rural Spain. Raised by parents who viewed children as economic assets rather than individuals deserving love and protection, Carmen learned early that survival required the ability to inflict pain on others before they could inflict it on her. Her childhood was marked by systematic abuse that she rationalized as normal family discipline, creating psychological patterns that would later manifest in her treatment of the children in her care. Carmen's marriage to Francisco was arranged by families seeking advantageous business connections, but their relationship developed into something far more sinister than a conventional partnership. They discovered that they shared a fascination with control and domination that extended far beyond normal marital dynamics. Their honeymoon period was spent visiting institutions across Europe where they studied different methods of managing large groups of dependent individuals. The couple's decision to focus their criminal activities on children came from Carmen's observation that adult victims retained too much autonomy and too many outside connections to be completely controlled. Children, especially orphaned or abandoned children, could be isolated more effectively and conditioned more thoroughly because they had no alternative sources of support or validation. Carmen understood that a child's natural need for adult approval could be weaponized to create levels of compliance that would be impossible to achieve with mature victims. Carmen's role in developing the family's conditioning protocols drew heavily from her study of animal training techniques, which she adapted for use with human subjects. She had observed that animals could be trained to perform complex behaviors through careful manipulation of their basic survival needs, and she theorized that similar principles could be applied to children with even greater effectiveness because of their higher intelligence and more complex emotional needs. Diego Martinez brought a different set of skills and experiences to the family enterprise, having spent years working in territorial prisons where he learned firsthand how institutional environments could be designed to break human will and eliminate resistance. His expertise in physical intimidation and violence provided the family with capabilities that Francisco's psychological manipulation and Carmen's conditioning techniques couldn't address on their own. Diego's prison experience had taught him that the most effective control systems combine physical restraint with psychological pressure in ways that made resistance seem both impossible and pointless. He had observed how prolonged isolation could break even the strongest individuals, and how the constant threat of violence could be more effective than actual brutality in maintaining compliance among large groups of prisoners. The techniques Diego brought from his prison work were adapted for use with children through modifications that took into account their smaller size, different psychological development, and unique vulnerabilities. He developed restraint systems that could incapacitate children without leaving obvious evidence of abuse, and he created punishment protocols that caused maximum psychological impact while minimizing the risk of permanent physical damage that might attract outside attention. Diego's understanding of institutional security proved invaluable in designing the sending physical modifications to the Sacred Heart Children's Sanctuary. His experience with prison architecture allowed him to create hidden spaces that were virtually impossible to escape from while also being undetectable to casual inspection. He understood how to use building layout, lighting, and acoustics to create environments that disoriented and intimidated occupants while facilitating complete control by their captors. Miguel Martinez represented perhaps the most disturbing element of the family's operation because his involvement demonstrated how systematic abuse could corrupt even children who were raised within the criminal enterprise. Miguel had been conditioned from early childhood to view the family's activities as normal and necessary, creating a second generation of predators who had never experienced normal human relationships or moral development. Miguel's upbringing within the family's twisted value system made him particularly effective at gaining the trust of new victims, because he genuinely believed that what the family was doing was beneficial for the children in their care. his conviction that their methods were helping rather than harming their victims allowed him to project sincerity and concern that more experienced predators couldn't replicate. The psychological grooming that shaped Miguel's development included exposure to carefully selected aspects of the family's operation that gradually normalized increasingly extreme behaviors. He was initially told that the children in their care were being saved from lives of poverty and degradation, and that the harsh treatment they received was necessary to break bad habits and instill proper moral values. As Miguel matured, he was given increasing responsibilities within the operation that slowly revealed its true nature, while simultaneously making him complicit in its continuation. By the time he understood the full scope of what they were doing, he had already participated in activities that would have made him liable for prosecution, creating psychological bonds to the family enterprise that made rebellion impossible. The family's expansion beyond their immediate relatives came through the recruitment of carefully selected individuals who shared their lack of moral constraints and their interest in exploiting vulnerable populations. These associates were chosen not just for their willingness to participate in criminal activities, but for their ability to maintain the public facades that protected the operation from outside scrutiny. Dr. James Peterson's recruitment exemplified the family's sophisticated approach to building their criminal network. Peterson had approached the Sacred Heart Children's Sanctuary, claiming to be interested in providing charitable medical services to disadvantaged children, but the family's investigation revealed that he had been quietly conducting unauthorized experiments on patients at other institutions for years. Rather than rejecting Peterson because of his criminal activities, the Martinez family recognized that his existing corruption made him an ideal partner who could provide medical cover for their operation while pursuing his own research interests, using their victims as subjects. Peterson's legitimate medical credentials gave the family access to pharmaceutical supplies and medical equipment that enhanced their ability to control and manipulate the children in their care. The family's relationship with Peterson also provided them with connections to other medical professionals who shared his lack of ethical constraints. Through Peterson's introductions, they gained access to a network of doctors, pharmacists, and medical researchers who were willing to provide services and supplies without asking uncomfortable questions about how they would be used. Judge Walter Hoffman's corruption followed a different pattern that demonstrated how the family exploited existing weaknesses in potential allies rather than creating those weaknesses themselves. Hoffman had been appointed to the juvenile court, despite having no particular qualifications for dealing with children, and his lack of experience made him susceptible to manipulation by anyone who claimed expertise in child welfare. The Martinez family's cultivation of Hoffman began with small favors and gradually escalated to more significant forms of cooperation as they demonstrated their ability to solve problems that made his job easier. Hoffman's primary concern was clearing cases from his docket as quickly as possible, and the family's willingness to accept any children he sent them, regardless of their actual need for institutional care, made them invaluable to his efforts to manage his caseload. Hoffman's financial corruption developed slowly as the family provided increasingly generous donations to his favorite charities and political causes. These contributions were presented as expressions of gratitude for his support of their mission, rather than direct bribes, allowing Hoffman to rationalize his acceptance of their money, while becoming increasingly dependent on their financial support. Police Captain Thomas Sullivan's involvement with the family began through his legitimate concerns about the growing population of homeless children on Chicago streets. Sullivan genuinely believed that removing these children from dangerous environments and placing them in institutional care was in their best interests, making him initially receptive to the Martinez family's offers to help solve what he saw as a serious social problem. The family's manipulation of Sullivan relied on gradually expanding his definition of which children needed intervention while simultaneously making it easier for his officers to process cases by accepting any children they brought to the facility. Sullivan's officers appreciated working with an institution that never questioned their judgment or created additional paperwork, and this convenience eventually led them to overlook irregularities that should have raised serious concerns. Sullivan's personal corruption began when the family offered to provide special services for his own family, including tutoring for his children and domestic help for his household. These services were provided by children from the facility who had been specially trained for such assignments, though Sullivan was never told about the conditioning process that made them so compliant and effective. The Martinez family's success in corrupting legitimate institutions and officials demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of human psychology and institutional dynamics. They recognized that most people could be manipulated through appeals to their existing interests and concerns rather than through direct threats or obvious bribes. Their approach focused on making their criminal activities appear to solve legitimate problems while gradually increasing their partners' dependence on the benefits of cooperation. The family's network of corrupt allies served multiple purposes, beyond simply protecting their operation from law enforcement intervention. These relationships provided them with access to resources, information, and opportunities that significantly expanded their criminal capabilities while also creating additional revenue streams that diversified their enterprise beyond the direct exploitation of children. Their ability to maintain these relationships over decades without significant defections or betrayals reflected both their skill at selecting appropriate targets for corruption and their understanding of how to manage criminal partnerships in ways that made exposure mutually disadvantageous for all parties involved. The psychological mechanisms that allowed so many people to participate in or enable the Martinez family's crimes revealed disturbing truths about human nature and the conditions that permit systematic evil to flourish in civilized societies. The family's success depended not just on their own moral corruption, but on the willingness of numerous others to ignore evidence of wrongdoing in exchange for personal benefits or the simple convenience of not having to confront uncomfortable realities. The Sacred Heart Children's Sanctuary stood as a monument to deception, its imposing facade concealing architectural modifications that transformed an ordinary Chicago brownstone into a labyrinth of hidden horrors. Francisco Martinez had spent months studying the building before purchase, recognizing that its unusual height and complex internal structure made it ideal for the extensive renovations his plans required. The original four-story structure had been built in 1878 as a private residence for a wealthy merchant family, featuring high ceilings, thick walls, and a sprawling attic space that would prove perfect for Francisco's sinister purposes. The building's transformation began immediately after the Martinez family took possession in 1891, working exclusively with immigrant laborers who spoke little English and asked few questions. Francisco supervised the construction of false walls, hidden passages, and concealed chambers that created an entirely separate facility within the existing structure. The workers were told they were building specialized educational spaces and therapy rooms for emotionally disturbed children, explanations that satisfied their curiosity while preventing them from understanding the true purpose of their modifications. Francisco's architectural genius lay in his understanding of how to create spaces that served dual purposes, appearing legitimate to casual observers while functioning as sophisticated prisons for their intended victims. The building's public areas were designed to impress visitors with their cleanliness, organization, and evidence of proper child care, featuring spacious dormitories with comfortable beds, well-equipped classrooms with educational materials, and recreational areas filled with toys and games that suggested happy, healthy childhood experiences. Behind these public facades, however, lay a network of hidden chambers, accessible only through concealed doorways and narrow passages that could be sealed from the outside to prevent escape or discovery. These spaces were connected by a complex system of tunnels and crawlways that allowed the Martinez family to move children between areas without any possibility of their presence being detected by unexpected visitors or official inspectors. The attic had been completely gutted and rebuilt to accommodate dozens of small chambers, each designed for specific purposes within the family's operation. Some rooms were equipped with restraint systems that immobilized children while allowing access for various forms of abuse, while others contained medical equipment that Dr. Peterson used for his experimental procedures. Still others were designed as observation rooms, where clients could watch activities in adjacent chambers through concealed viewing panels without being seen by their victims. The building's heating and ventilation systems had been modified to allow precise control over environmental conditions in different areas. The Martinez family could create extreme temperatures, eliminate air circulation, or introduce noxious fumes into specific chambers as forms of punishment or conditioning. These environmental controls were operated from a central panel in Francisco's private office, allowing him to manage the entire facility's climate with the precision of a laboratory experiment. Sound control represented another crucial element of the building's modifications. Francisco had invested heavily in soundproofing, materials and techniques that prevented noise from traveling between the public and private areas of the facility. The hidden chambers were lined with thick padding that absorbed screams and cries for help, while the public areas were equipped with phonographs and musical instruments that could mask any sounds that might penetrate the soundproofing during official visits. The lighting systems in the hidden areas were designed to disorient and intimidate rather than illuminate. Many chambers were kept in complete darkness to break down children's sense of time and reality, while others were subjected to harsh electric lights that prevented sleep and created constant stress. Francisco had studied the psychological effects of different lighting conditions and used this knowledge to create environments that maximized his victims' vulnerability to manipulation and control. The building's basement had been excavated far deeper than city building codes permitted, creating additional levels of hidden chambers that extended nearly to the water table beneath Chicago's streets. These subterranean spaces were used for the most extreme forms of abuse and for disposing of children who had died during their captivity. Francisco had installed a sophisticated drainage system that could handle large volumes of water and other fluids, suggesting uses too horrific for detailed description. Access to the hidden areas was controlled through an elaborate system of locks, keys, and mechanical devices that prevented unauthorized entry while allowing the Martinez family to move freely throughout their domain. Each family member carried different keys that provided access to specific areas based on their role in the operation, ensuring that no single person except Francisco could access every part of the facility. The intake process for new arrivals began in what appeared to be a standard reception area, where children were welcomed by Carmen Martinez and given orientation, talks about the wonderful opportunities that awaited them at the Sacred Heart Children's Sanctuary. This initial contact was designed to create positive impressions while gathering crucial information about each child's background, family connections, and psychological vulnerabilities that would determine their treatment and ultimate fate. Children who arrived at the facility were typically exhausted, frightened, and grateful for any sign of kindness or stability after their experiences on Chicago's dangerous streets. Carmen's maternal demeanor and genuine seeming concern for their welfare created powerful psychological bonds that made resistance to later abuse much more difficult. She had perfected the ability to project warmth and safety while conducting detailed assessments that identified each child's potential value and the most effective methods for breaking their will. The orientation process included medical examinations conducted by Dr. Peterson, who used these sessions to evaluate each child's physical condition while also beginning the psychological conditioning that would make them compliant victims. Peterson's examinations were far more invasive and humiliating than necessary for legitimate medical purposes, serving as the first step in a systematic process designed to break down natural modesty and self-respect. Following their initial processing, children were assigned to different categories based on age, physical characteristics, and perceived resistance to authority. The most attractive and compliant children were immediately identified for special treatment that prepared them for the family's most profitable activities, while those who showed signs of defiance or independence were subjected to intensive conditioning designed to eliminate their resistance or break their spirits entirely. The facility's daily routine was carefully designed to create maximum psychological impact while maintaining the appearance of legitimate educational and rehabilitative programming. Children were awakened before dawn for mandatory prayer sessions, led by Francisco, who used these gatherings to reinforce their dependence on the family's authority while identifying any signs of resistance or rebellion that required immediate attention. Breakfast consisted of thin porridge and stale bread, barely enough nutrition to sustain life, but insufficient to maintain normal energy levels or physical development. The inadequate diet served multiple purposes, keeping children weak and lethargic, while also creating constant hunger that could be used as a tool for behavioral control. Children who pleased their captors might receive slightly larger portions or occasional treats, while those who showed defiance faced further reduction in their already minimal food allocation. The morning hours were devoted to what the Martinez family called educational instruction, though the actual content bore little resemblance to conventional academic subjects. Children were taught absolute obedience to authority, the sinfulness of resistance or complaint, and their inherent worthlessness that made them deserving of whatever treatment they received. These lessons were reinforced through repetitive exercises that required children to confess their moral failings and beg forgiveness for imaginary sins. Francisco had developed an elaborate theological framework that portrayed the family's abuse as necessary for the children's spiritual salvation. He taught that suffering was required for purification of the soul, and that resistance to their treatment was resistance to God's will. His knowledge of Scripture allowed him to quote biblical passages in support of any abuse, no matter how extreme, convincing many children that their torture was somehow sanctified by divine approval. The afternoon hours were devoted to labor that generated income for the Martinez family, while exhausting the children physically and mentally. The facility operated several small manufacturing enterprises that produced goods for sale in Chicago's markets, including clothing, household items, and decorative objects that were crafted entirely by child labor under dangerous and unhealthy conditions. Children worked 12-hour shifts in poorly ventilated spaces, filled with toxic fumes from dyes, chemicals, and industrial processes that caused immediate health problems and long-term developmental damage. Those who became too sick or weak to maintain productivity were either eliminated or transferred to other forms of service that required less physical strength but often proved even more degrading and harmful. The evening hours brought the most terrifying aspect of life in the Sacred Heart Children's Sanctuary, when the facility's true business began with the arrival of clients who paid for access to children who had been specifically prepared for their entertainment. These sessions were conducted in the hidden chambers where the family's public facade could be completely abandoned, and their victims subjected to forms of abuse that defied comprehension. The Martinez family had developed an elaborate classification system for their clients based on their preferences, payment capacity, and level of discretion required. Basic memberships provided access to group activities, where multiple clients could observe the humiliation of children for modest fees, while premium services offered private sessions with specific victims who had been selected and conditioned according to individual client specifications. The most expensive platinum services allowed clients to participate in the selection and conditioning of new arrivals, designing personalized abuse scenarios that satisfied their particular fantasies, while generating maximum revenue for the Martinez family. These elite clients often maintained long-term relationships with specific children, creating additional income streams through ongoing abuse contracts that could extend for months or years. The facility's hidden chambers were equipped with specialized furniture and apparatus designed to facilitate various forms of abuse while preventing escape or resistance. Francisco had studied historical torture devices and modern restraint techniques to create equipment that maximized his client's satisfaction while minimizing the risk of permanent damage that might affect the children's long-term utility. Martinez's family maintained detailed records of client preferences and activities that served both business and security purposes. These records allowed them to match clients with appropriate victims, while also providing insurance against potential exposure through documented evidence of their customers' criminal activities. The threat of exposure kept clients loyal, while the promise of discretion attracted new customers who valued the family's reputation for maintaining absolute secrecy. The facility's most disturbing innovation was its breeding program, though. The Martinez family used more euphemistic terminology to describe their systematic exploitation of reproductive capacity among their older victims. Female children who reached adolescence were subjected to forced pregnancy programs that produced additional victims, while generating revenue through the sale of infants to childless couples or medical institutions that required subjects for experimental procedures. Carmen Martinez supervised this aspect of the operation with the same cold efficiency she brought to other forms of abuse, maintaining detailed health records that tracked menstrual cycles, pregnancies, and physical development. With the precision of livestock management, her knowledge of herbal remedies and primitive medical procedures allowed her to terminate unwanted pregnancies or ensure successful births, depending on what would be most profitable for the family at any given time. The Martinez family's reign of terror might have continued indefinitely, if not for a series of seemingly unrelated events in the spring of 1923 that gradually exposed their operation to scrutiny from sources they had never anticipated. The first crack in their carefully constructed facade came from Detective Robert O'Malley of the Chicago Police Department, who had been investigating a string of disappearances in the Irish neighborhood surrounding the Sacred Heart Children's Sanctuary without initially suspecting any connection to the facility. O'Malley's investigation began as a routine missing persons case that had attracted little attention from his superiors or the press. Young children were vanishing from the streets at an alarming rate, but their disappearances generated minimal concern because most of the victims were homeless orphans or runaways whose absence went unnoticed by anyone in positions of authority. The detective's interest in the case became personal when his own nephew, Timothy O'Malley, disappeared after being arrested for stealing food from a bakery. Timothy was a bright 12-year-old boy who had been living on the streets since his parents died in a tenement fire the previous winter. Despite his circumstances, he had maintained contact with his uncle and had never been involved in serious criminal activity beyond the petty theft necessary for survival. His sudden disappearance after what should have been a minor court appearance struck O'Malley as highly suspicious and motivated him to begin a more thorough investigation into the fate of missing children. The detective's inquiries led him to discover irregularities in juvenile court records that suggested systematic manipulation of the legal system. Children who were arrested for minor offenses were being sentenced to institutional care at rates far exceeding historical norms, and an unusually high percentage of these placements were being made at the Sacred Heart Children's Sanctuary. When O'Malley attempted to visit the facility to check on his nephew's welfare, he was told that Timothy had been transferred to another institution for specialized treatment, but no records of such a transfer could be produced. O'Malley's suspicions were further aroused when he discovered that several other missing children had last been seen in the vicinity of the Sacred Heart facility, though none had been officially admitted according to the records provided by Carmen Martinez. The detective began conducting surveillance of the building and noticed suspicious activities that seemed inconsistent with the operation of a legitimate children's home, including the delivery of large quantities of medical supplies and construction materials that had no apparent connection to child care. The situation became critical when O'Malley enlisted the help of Sister Margaret Kelly, a reform-minded nun who had been documenting irregularities in the city's child welfare system as part of her work with the Catholic Charities Organization. Sister Kelly had noticed that children referred to certain institutions were disappearing from the welfare system entirely, with no records of their graduation, transfer, or death that would account for their absence from official documentation. Sister Kelly's investigation had uncovered evidence that intake records were being falsified and that the stated purposes of various placements bore little relationship to the actual needs or circumstances of the children involved. Her attempts to conduct follow-up visits with children she had personally referred to different institutions had been consistently frustrated by administrative obstacles and bureaucratic delays that seemed designed to prevent contact with former residents. The collaboration between O'Malley and Sister Kelly created a formidable investigative team that combined police authority with religious credibility, making it much more difficult for the Martinez family's network of corrupt allies to dismiss or discredit their inquiries. Their joint investigation began to attract attention from reform-minded journalists and civic leaders who had been increasingly concerned about corruption in Chicago's municipal institutions. The Martinez family's response to this growing scrutiny revealed both their sophisticated understanding of threat management and their fundamental lack of concern for human life. Rather than attempting to reform their operation or reduce its visibility, they decided to eliminate the sources of investigation through methods that had served them well in dealing with previous challenges to their authority. Francisco Martinez instructed Diego to arrange accidents for both O'Malley and Sister Kelly that would appear to be random crimes typical of Chicago's dangerous streets. However, Diego's attempt to eliminate the detective backfired dramatically when O'Malley survived an assassination attempt that was clearly professional in nature, suggesting organized criminal involvement rather than street crime. The failed murder attempt convinced O'Malley that he was investigating something far more serious than simple administrative corruption. Sister Kelly's survival of a similar attack on the same night created additional problems for the Martinez family by generating widespread publicity and attracting the attention of church authorities, who had previously been willing to overlook irregularities in the city's child welfare system. The Catholic diocese launched its own investigation into threats against its personnel, bringing resources and expertise that the family had not anticipated having to counter. The Martinez family situation deteriorated further when Dr. Peterson was arrested on unrelated charges stemming from his illegal medical experiments at other institutions throughout Chicago. Peterson's arrest provided investigators with access to detailed records of his activities that included extensive documentation of his work at the Sacred Heart Children's Sanctuary, revealing the true nature of the medical services he had been providing to the Martinez family. Under intense interrogation by federal investigators who were interested in his violations of medical ethics and drug trafficking laws, Peterson revealed crucial details about the facility's hidden chambers and the systematic abuse being conducted there. His cooperation was motivated not by remorse, but by a desperate attempt to reduce his own criminal liability by providing evidence against his former partners in the Martinez operation. Peterson's testimony provided investigators with detailed floor plans of the facility's hidden areas and specific information about the location of evidence that would prove the scope of the family's crimes. His medical records also documented the physical condition of numerous children over several years, providing evidence of systematic abuse that could not be explained away as legitimate disciplinary measures or medical treatment. The final crisis for the Martinez family came when Timothy O'Malley managed to escape from the facility during a power outage that disabled the electrical lock securing the hidden chambers. The boy had been subjected to months of conditioning and abuse, but his strong relationship with his uncle had provided him with psychological resilience that the family's techniques had been unable to completely break. Timothy's escape was facilitated by his knowledge of the building's layout, which he had gained through his work assignments in different areas of the facility. Unlike other children who had become disoriented by the deliberately confusing architecture, Timothy had maintained his sense of direction and had secretly mapped the passages and chambers during his captivity, waiting for an opportunity to use this knowledge to reach freedom. The boy's arrival at his uncle's apartment in the early hours of December 15, 1923, provided investigators with their first eyewitness account of conditions inside the Sacred Heart Children's Sanctuary. Timothy's testimony was particularly credible because of his family connection to a respected police officer, and because his physical condition provided obvious evidence of the abuse he had endured during his months of captivity. Timothy's descriptions of the facility's hidden chambers and the systematic abuse conducted there gave investigators the specific information they needed to obtain search warrants and plan a coordinated raid that would overcome the Martinez family's security measures. His knowledge of the building's layout allowed police to identify entrance points and passages that would provide access to areas that had never been seen by outside authorities. The raid on the Sacred Heart Children's Sanctuary on December 18, 1923, revealed horrors that exceeded even the investigators' worst expectations based on Timothy's testimony and Peterson's revelations. Police officers who entered the hidden chambers discovered dozens of children in various stages of physical and psychological breakdown, along with evidence of systematic torture, medical experimentation, and forms of abuse that challenged their understanding of human depravity. The scene that greeted the rescue teams defied description and challenged the limits of what trained law enforcement officers could psychologically process. Children were found chained in chambers that had obviously been designed for prolonged captivity, showing signs of malnutrition, disease, and injuries that could only have resulted from deliberate torture. Many were so psychologically damaged that they could not respond to offers of help or understand that their ordeal was ending. The Martinez family's reaction to the raid demonstrated their complete lack of human conscience and their primary concern with destroying evidence rather than protecting the children in their care. Francisco Martinez was found in his office attempting to burn records and financial documents, while Carmen Martinez was discovered in the facility's medical area methodically poisoning children who were too injured or traumatized to be moved quickly. Diego Martinez attempted to escape through the tunnel system he had constructed, but was cornered by officers who had been alerted to the passages by Timothy's information. His capture was complicated by his use of children as human shields, demonstrating the family's willingness to sacrifice their victims to protect themselves even when their operation was clearly finished. Miguel Martinez's capture revealed perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the family's operation, as investigators discovered that he had been systematically training some of the older children to assist in the abuse of younger victims. This recruitment of victims as perpetrators represented a level of psychological manipulation that horrified even experienced investigators who thought they had seen every form of human cruelty. The immediate aftermath of the raid created a media sensation that spread far beyond Chicago as newspapers across the country competed to expose the most shocking details of the Martinez family's crimes. The scale and systematic nature of the abuse, combined with evidence of corruption reaching into the highest levels of city government, created a public outcry that could not be suppressed through the usual methods of political influence and media manipulation. The rescue operation recovered 43 living children from the facility, though many were so physically and psychologically damaged that their survival remained uncertain. The discovery of human remains in the facility's basement chambers suggested that the total number of victims was far higher than the official count, with evidence indicating that systematic disposal of bodies had been ongoing for years. Judge Walter Hoffman's suicide on the night following the raid provided dramatic confirmation of the corruption network that had protected the Martinez family's operation. His death was accompanied by a detailed confession that implicated dozens of other officials and prominent citizens in various aspects of the criminal enterprise, creating a roadmap for investigators who were struggling to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. Police Captain Thomas Sullivan's attempt to flee Chicago with his family was thwarted when federal agents arrested him at Union Station with a suitcase containing cash payments from the Martinez family and detailed records of his cooperation with their operation. His subsequent confession provided investigators with crucial evidence about the systematic manipulation of the juvenile justice system that had supplied victims to the facility. The arrest of numerous prominent citizens implicated in the Martinez family's crimes created a political crisis that extended far beyond the criminal justice system, as Chicago's civic leaders struggled to maintain public confidence in institutions that had been thoroughly corrupted by their association with the systematic abuse of children. The trials that followed the Martinez family's exposure became a national sensation that fundamentally changed American attitudes toward child protection and institutional oversight. Francisco Martinez faced execution for multiple counts of murder, torture, and conspiracy, though his trial was complicated by questions about his mental competency that his defense attorneys raised in desperate attempts to avoid the death penalty. His courtroom demeanor alternated between defiant proclamations of innocence and rambling theological justifications for his actions that convinced most observers of his complete moral corruption. Carmen Martinez received life imprisonment after prosecutors accepted a plea bargain in exchange for her testimony against other members of the conspiracy. Her detailed knowledge of the facility's operations and the systematic conditioning methods used on children provided crucial evidence that helped convict dozens of accomplices and clients. During her incarceration, Carmen showed no signs of remorse and continued to insist that their work had been necessary for the moral salvation of degenerate children who could not be helped through conventional means. Diego Martinez was executed alongside his brother after a brief trial that focused primarily on his role in constructing the facility's torture chambers, and his Brucher trial that focused primarily on his role in constructing the facility's torture cheese. Attempts to murder Detective O'Malley and Sister Margaret Kelly. His execution was delayed for several months while investigators used his knowledge of the building's hidden areas to locate additional evidence and recover more victims' remains from concealed burial sites throughout the property. Miguel Martinez's trial raised disturbing questions about criminal responsibility for individuals who had been raised within systematic abuse environments, despite evidence that he had been conditioned from childhood to view the family's activities as normal. The court ultimately determined that his adult participation in the torture and murder of children warranted execution. His case became a precedent for how legal systems should handle perpetrators who were themselves victims of childhood abuse. Dr. James Peterson's cooperation with investigators earned him a reduced sentence of life imprisonment, though he died in prison less than 3 years later under circumstances that suggested his fellow inmates had learned the nature of his crimes and decided to dispense their own form of justice. His detailed medical records provided evidence that helped prosecute numerous other participants in the conspiracy, while also contributing to medical understanding of trauma's long-term effects on child development. The corruption trials that followed exposed the systematic failure of Chicago's civic institutions to protect vulnerable children, leading to the resignation or prosecution of over 60 public officials including judges, police officers, and city administrators. Many of these individuals received relatively light sentences due to their cooperation with investigators and their claims that they had been deceived about the true nature of the Martinez family's operation. The 43 children rescued from the Sacred Heart facility faced long and difficult recovery processes that challenged contemporary understanding of psychological trauma and rehabilitation. Many never fully recovered from their experiences and required institutional care for the remainder of their lives. Timothy O'Malley became one of the few success stories, eventually completing his education and becoming a social worker dedicated to protecting other vulnerable children. The facility itself was demolished in 1925 after investigators completed their examination of the evidence contained within its walls. The city declared the property unsuitable for any future construction and converted it into a memorial park dedicated to the victims of institutional abuse. Even today, many Chicago residents avoid the area, reporting feelings of unease and sadness that they cannot explain but that seem connected to the lingering psychological impact of the horrors that occurred there. The Martinez case prompted comprehensive reforms in child welfare laws across the United States, establishing new requirements for institutional oversight, mandatory reporting of suspected abuse, and regular inspection protocols that made it much more difficult for similar operations to function undetected. These reforms, known collectively as the Chicago Protection Acts, became models for child welfare legislation in other states and countries. The case also influenced the development of modern understanding of institutional abuse and trauma psychology. As researchers studied the survivors to understand how systematic abuse affected child development and what interventions might help victims recover from their experiences. This research contributed to advances in trauma therapy and child protection that continue to benefit vulnerable children today. Perhaps most significantly, the Martinez family case demonstrated how systematic evil could flourish in plain sight. When good people chose to ignore warning signs or rationalize evidence of wrongdoing, the number of officials, clients, and community members who participated in or enabled the family's crimes revealed disturbing truths about human nature and the conditions that allow atrocities to continue unchallenged. The investigation also revealed that the Martinez operation was not unique but part of a broader pattern of institutional abuse that affected similar facilities across the country. Evidence found in the family's records led to investigations in other cities that uncovered comparable operations, though none proved to be as large or systematically brutal as the Chicago enterprise. The financial records seized during the raid showed that the Martinez family had accumulated wealth equivalent to millions in modern currency through their criminal enterprise, demonstrating that the systematic abuse of children could be extraordinarily profitable when conducted with sufficient organization and protection from law enforcement. This revelation led to new laws requiring greater financial transparency from charitable institutions and stricter oversight of their funding sources. The psychological impact of the Martinez case extended far beyond its immediate victims to affect an entire generation of Americans who struggled to understand how such systematic cruelty could have been permitted to continue for over 30 years. The case became a cautionary tale that influenced literature, journalism, and social reform movements for decades, serving as a reminder of the potential for evil that exists when authority figures are granted unchecked power over vulnerable populations. Detective Robert O'Malley received national recognition for his investigation and went on to develop new protocols for investigating institutional abuse that are still used by law enforcement agencies today. His emphasis on listening to victims' accounts and following financial evidence helped expose numerous other criminal operations that had been hiding behind charitable facades. Sister Margaret Kelly's advocacy work contributed to significant reforms within Catholic child welfare institutions and helped establish new safeguards designed to prevent similar abuses in religious organizations. Her documentation methods became standard practice for social workers investigating suspected institutional abuse, emphasizing the importance of detailed record keeping and persistent follow-up with vulnerable populations. The Martinez family's legacy serves as a permanent reminder that those who claim moral authority over others must be subjected to the most rigorous scrutiny and accountability measures. Their ability to operate for decades under the cover of religious charity demonstrates how easily good intentions can be perverted and how dangerous it can be to grant unrestricted access to vulnerable populations without adequate oversight. The children who suffered and died in the Sacred Heart Children's Sanctuary are remembered not just as victims of individual criminals, but as casualties of the system that failed to protect those who most needed protection. Their memory continues to inspire efforts to improve child welfare institutions and ensure that the horrors they endured can never be repeated. The Martinez case remains relevant today as communities continue to struggle with questions about how to balance the need for institutional child care with the imperative to protect children from those who would exploit their vulnerability. The lessons learned from this dark chapter in American history continue to inform modern efforts to create safe, accountable systems for caring for society's most defenseless members. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.